As Armenia marks the 111th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide, the country is also facing a pivotal political and security moment. With a new European Union civilian mission deployed to the country and parliamentary elections approaching in June, what could these developments mean not just for Armenia's future, but for the entire region of the South Caucasus? Well, joining me now to discuss is Richard Giragosian, founding director of the Regional Studies Center. Richard, so glad to have you here with us on World Talks here on TVP World. Richard, but just before I get into the situation in Armenia, I do want to ask you more specifically about President Zelenskyy's visit to Azerbaijan. If you can tell us a little bit of how that unfolded, and will he also be visiting Armenia? Will he not be visiting Armenia? And also a reaction from Armenia to Zelenskyy's visit to meeting with Ilham Aliyev.
Well, the Ukrainian president's visit in Baku, Azerbaijan, was very much normal and natural, a reflection of the pre-existing bilateral relationship between Ukraine and Azerbaijan. He is not expected to come to Armenia this regional tour, but the Armenian government remains very patient and very committed to the deepening of its own relationship with Ukraine. So I don't think it's particularly significant beyond the concept of Ukrainian defense after Russia's failed invasion.
And is Armenia, how are Armenians reacting to just ordinary Armenians? How are they seeing that Ukrainian president visiting Azerbaijan? I do know, of course, particularly right now with Armenia heading into parliamentary elections in June, do correct me if I'm wrong, but the country is still relatively polarized, still does remain a little bit divided, with many still having pro-Russian views. How is Armenia viewing this part of Zelensky's trip to Azerbaijan?
Well, to be honest, there is no reaction. In terms of Armenian society, there's much more of a focus on local economics and politics and the bigger question of the threat from Russia. Moreover, Armenia's bilateral diplomatic engagement with Azerbaijan does not involve any third party. So in many ways, for our public opinion and the Armenian government, this is very much a remote issue.
Richard, how did the commemorations go on Friday, on April 24? Was this time different, given the fact that the peace declaration was signed in August of last year?
Well, I would say the recent commemorative anniversary of the Armenian Genocide, recognized on April 24th, was again the defining element of Armenian identity. Within the Republic of Armenia, there was a degree of frustration in terms of the outlook and expectation of normalizing relations with neighboring Turkey, where Armenia very much sees the ball in Turkey's court. And unfortunately, Armenian patience with Turkey is not without limit. And there is a need to normalize relations, especially given the progress between Armenia and Azerbaijan over the past year.
So how is that going? Actually, my next question to you, of this normalization process between Turkey and Armenia, do we have news on maybe the opening of a border, of the railway border, of a land border? How is that situation looking like?
Well, what we saw this past March, last month, was the initial launch of Turkish Airlines connections and presence in Armenia, a very positive step forward. But to be honest, Turkey remains hostage or prisoner to Azerbaijan. Turkey is warily cautious, and in terms of normalization, feels that it needs more support, if not endorsement, from Azerbaijan itself to fully move forward. This is regrettable, but it is indirectly related in terms of Armenia and Armenia-Turkey. Having said that, the unprecedented progress between Armenia and Azerbaijan means Turkey has less reason and little justification not to normalize relations.
Richard, what do you think is dividing Armenia more, if that's the right word I can use? Its relations with Turkey, or its relations with Azerbaijan? What's a more difficult pill to swallow for Armenians?
Well, in general, despite the legacy of the Armenian Genocide, despite the historical revisionism of the Turkish government, it is actually Armenia-Azerbaijan that is much more painful, much more recent, and much more of an obstacle, especially given Azerbaijan's prior maximalist position. And unfortunately, the forced expulsion, the ethnic cleansing of Armenians from Nagorno-Karabakh by Azerbaijan has done little to reassure or restore confidence. Having said that, we do see, as stated, unprecedented progress, and this is only likely to continue.
So there's very important things that you said there, continue, but just before we get back to what you said, a key word there, progress. While you were talking, Richard, we did see a footage there from actually a tour that I did, TVP World, last September with the European Union monitoring mission in Armenia. I want us to listen to, just for a moment, for a sound bite of, so I was speaking to who is now the former head of the EU monitoring mission, Markus Ritter. Let's listen to one of the challenges that they had.
We had two political challenges. First with the Russians, who still say that up to today that we are a covert NATO mission, that we are a kind of spearhead of the West, who again tries, like in other Eastern European countries, to kick out Russia from its old zone of influence. And we had our problems with the Azerbaijanis.
All right, Richard, this was my conversation with Markus Ritter back in September. Is this still accurate? Do the Russians still see any EU mission that's deployed to Armenia as a covert NATO operation? And while I'm in that, I do understand that now there is a new EU partnership mission in Armenia. Can you tell us about that as well?
Well, very good. In fact, that clip is taken from a very impressive TVP documentary. And what we saw was the former head of the monitoring mission of the EU, Markus Ritter, pointing to the latest in Russian disinformation, accusing the EU of engaging in Armenia based on some kind of NATO conspiracy. Of course, this is a false allegation, but it does reflect the weakness of Russia in Armenia and the region. Russia remains overwhelmed and distracted by its failed invasion of Ukraine. Having said that, what we also see is a degree of much greater strategic significance of Armenia to the West in general and to the EU in particular. And what we see now is three different EU levels of engagement. The pre-existing EU monitoring mission, which your documentary covered well, but second is the rapid reaction force from the EU to counter hybrid threats that is coming to Armenia in preparation for the June 7th election. The third, more comprehensive level of engagement is a 2-year EU engagement with a separate mission focusing on hybrid threats. This is more about strengthening democracy in Armenia. Much of this EU engagement is driven by the unpredictability of the Trump administration, but also the vacuum that was created in the wake of Russia's weakness. So I do think Armenia has much greater strategic significance, has overtaken Georgia as the leading democracy in the region, and this is about Brussels investing in Yerevan.
Richard, you did mention here the parliamentary elections that are coming up on the 7th of June. What can we expect? Tell us about some of the parties running, and do you think that the current Prime Minister has a chance of winning? And most importantly, let's take a worst case scenario. I will play devil's advocate here. What happens to Armenia and to the region and to all these Western ties that the current Armenian government has created and has formed if if Nikol Pashinyan loses these elections, because we do know that the other candidates are pro-Russian?
Well, what we see is one thing for certain. There are firm expectations that Armenia will hold its third back-to-back genuinely free and fair election in June. That's a very important accomplishment, where Armenia, no matter what the results are, is endowed with a rare commodity of legitimacy. In terms of the election itself, the incumbent government holds the advantage simply because there's no credible alternative to the Pashinyan government. In other words, the opposition remains increasingly unpopular, marginalized, and divided. And their failure to articulate an alternative strategy is not winning them any votes. Moreover, much of the Russian-leaning opposition has no experience earning votes, much more closely affiliated with the previous, more authoritarian governments in Armenia. So that makes it most likely the Armenian government will secure re-election, no real change in policy or strategy. If, however, the opposition wins the election, their lack of a coherent alternative strategy puts everything in doubt, questioning diplomacy with Azerbaijan, as well as opening the door for perhaps a return of Russian power to Armenia. This is something that would be a negative development, not just for Armenia, but also for the West.
And what about its ties to the United States? I mean, we do know that the United States, had invested, of course, a lot of, millions of dollars to implement also this trip route, right? The Trump route for international peace and prosperity. What were to happen if the government would shift course?
Well, the very immodestly named Trump route for international peace and prosperity has yet to begin as a project. Nevertheless, it is an important deterrent in terms of making the risk of renewed fighting with Azerbaijan much less likely. However, given developments in Armenian politics as well as unpredictability in Washington, this project is one of many in terms of connectivity, and its future is much less assured, especially after the war against Iran to the south.
Thank you so much, Richard Giragosian, founding director at the Regional Studies Center. Always a pleasure of having you here and breaking down all the latest updates from the South Caucasus.
Thank you.
And that's all for this edition of World Talks here on TVP World. I'm Diana Skaya. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.